If you are new to us, we are in the middle of a whole year having a conversation between the Old Testament and the New Testament, between Exodus and the Gospel, and specifically the Gospel of Mark. And this morning, we are in the wilderness, and we've been in the wilderness for a while now. The people of Israel, or the Israelites, have been in the wilderness for about 40 days at this point after they escaped from Egypt. But also in the Gospel of Mark, last week, we read about Jesus' disciples being in a kind of a wilderness, just as we are often in the wilderness. The last 2 Sundays have had the exact same point in the sermon, and guess what? Third week in a row, same point. Maybe you can recite it with me. Look back with gratitude. Look forward with trust. Look back with gratitude. Look forward with trust. So important for us when we're in our seasons of wilderness. The Drakes, a family of 6, really we're a family of 4, but we have a dog and a cat. Our cat is Bridget. Bridget is 17 years old. Best cat ever. She thinks she's a dog. She kind of follows us around the house and she sits on our lap. We've had her since she was 2. This cat has never gone hungry. She has never gone thirsty. We change her litter box. She comes up and sits on our lap. I know the exact spot to scratch her behind her ears. We've learned her preferences. And do you know that one of her preferences is that she will not drink from a bowl, from a pet bowl? She will only drink her water from a human glass, wherever she can find it. And even this morning, she drank from my glass, even though my husband, about 2 years ago, gave in to her and bought her a very lovely margarita glass that sits on a table next to our couch. So she can have all the water she wants anytime she wants from her own margarita glass. But does she? No, she does not. She finds whatever glass I have or have left out or think I'm drinking from, and she chirps. She does a lot of chirping. She currently doesn't like the food that we've had to feed her because the vet tells us we have to feed her this food. So she's taken to following me around the house. You know how cats do? She'll cut me off. Like, I'm really glad that I have good balance because I would have tripped over her and had several broken bones by now. She squawks because she doesn't like the food we give her. So she cuts me off and she leads me. She makes sure I go to her food bowl so that I can notice that even though it's full, it's not the food she prefers. Our cat is not a good sport. She's had 15 years with us. She knows we're good for it. She knows we'll feed her. She knows we'll give her water. She knows that we will pet her behind her ears. She knows that we'll take her to the vet when she's sick. I kind of, this week, have been thinking the Hebrew people are a little bit like Bridget. But you know what else? So am I. They chirp. They're in the wilderness for just over a month. They're on their way to Sinai, where they're going to get the law, which is going to teach them how to be in community and freedom together. Right now, they're learning how to trust God, right? They've been set free. They've been rescued, watered, fed, taken care of. Maybe they didn't like the manna, but they had the manna, just like Bridget had the margarita glass. God provided. How did God care for God's people? Like a shepherd. Not like a cat owner, like a shepherd. Psalm 23 doesn't say, the Lord is my cat trainer. No, it says, the Lord is my shepherd. Even when we're chirping, the Lord is our shepherd. This morning, we will see God provide water from a rock, and we will see God provide defense from enemies. How to look back with gratitude and look forward with trust, trusting the one that holds the shepherd's staff. As we read this morning, I want us to notice Moses' shepherd staff. It's a common tradition, this week I read, for shepherds who have the same staff from the beginning of their career. When they have a significant experience as a shepherd, they'll mark a spot on their staff to remember it. Very interesting. They'll start at the bottom and work their way to the top. So maybe I can picture the shepherds gathered around the fire at night saying, oh yeah, I got this one when the lion came. I got this one when there was no water and I found water. This one when I fell asleep, that kind of thing. I think that's what's happening now. When Moses was called by God to go back to Egypt, remember, God asked him, what's that you have in your hand there? Oh, it's a staff, a shepherd's staff. And that's the staff that Moses continues to carry when he goes to Pharaoh, when God turns the Nile into blood, when God parts the Red Sea, and now this morning when he gives water. So let's start. Exodus 17 is in two parts. We're going to take a few minutes in each part and then gather around the sacrament. Exodus 17. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" Do you hear Bridget? Why are you chirping? But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." We're here again. Seems like every week we're here, doesn't it? Remember some of the words that the Israelites said? Chapter 5, "May the Lord look on you, Moses, and judge you. You've made us obnoxious to Pharaoh, and now they're going to kill us." Chapter 14, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" Chapter 15, "The people grumbled against Moses, saying, 'What are we to drink?' Chapter 16, "If only we died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. At least there we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you've brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Chirp, chirp, chirp. They're testing God. They're saying, is God here or not? And Moses is a little frustrated, isn't he? Verse 5, "The Lord answered Moses, 'Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. And I'll stand before you by the rock at Horeb.'" I wonder what that looked like, God standing on the rock. "Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Thirst is real. This is the second time that the freed Hebrew people are thirsty. The first time we read that God tested the people to see if they would trust him, and this time we read that the people are testing God. I think that's very interesting. What does that mean? The people are testing God. God's character never changes. God is always generous, whether we feel like God is generous or not. God is always good, whether we're experiencing that goodness or not. There are these questions. The Bible Project guys have a podcast on this chapter, and they observe that it's as if the Hebrew people have acclimated themselves to grace and acclimated themselves to the provision of God so much that their attitude has shifted from, "Wow, God saved us," to, "Well, I deserve this. God better show up for me," like God owes them something. Like Bridget. Does that cat ever reflect on the magnificence of the hand that feeds her? No, she does not. Or like maybe you have kids in your house, and maybe you provide food for your children. And maybe sometimes the children open the fridge and say, "There's no food in here," right? It's like that. Instead of saying, "Thank you so much, Mom and Dad, for providing food for me," they say, "How come we don't have any ice cream?" Right? We know that God is good. We know that God is patient. But we test his patience, just like our kids test our patience, just like Bridget tests my patience. Like, someday I'm not going to put food in her bowl, right? No, I'm always going to put food in her bowl. Here, Israel has a need, and the people are responding with inappropriate levels of quarreling, and God leads the way God is, with generosity. God gives water and manna and quail, even though they are rude and unkind and do not trust God for it. God gives it anyway. God leads with generosity. This portion of Exodus gets set up and becomes a holiday in the Israelite tradition. It gets remembered in the festival of Sukkot. You might see tents up in the northern part of Stamford in the fall for the Feast of Tabernacles. Let's fast forward 1,500 years or so from this desert wandering. This is a week-long celebration in Jerusalem for the sole purpose of remembering the way that God provided for God's people when they were in the wilderness. People live in tents, recalling that we all are living in a wilderness of some time. And the festival also looks forward to the future deliverance of God. It happens in the harvest time, and the fall was generally a period of drought in Israel. The rains wouldn't have come since spring. The cisterns are low. The springs would be becoming weak, and the hills would be barren. The ground can't be renewed without water. Therefore, as a part of the festival, there would be prayer for water to replenish the country agriculturally, as well as to refresh the land spiritually. Every day of the feast, there was a water ceremony with a procession of priests marching to the southern border of the city to a spring. And in that spring, the priest would fill a golden pitcher with water, and a choir would chant Isaiah 12:3 that says, "With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation." The water then would be carried back up the hill through the water gate, followed by crowds, and the crowds would be carrying branches. One hand would be branches representing the wilderness, and the other hand would be branches from citrus fruits representing the harvest. And they would be reciting Psalms, usually Psalm 118. "Give thanks to the Lord our God, for he is good. His love endures forever." When the procession arrived at the temple, the priest would climb the altar steps. Remember, the altar is where they sacrificed the animals. And he'd pour water over the altar while the crowd circled around him, singing. And on the seventh and final day of the festival, this procession of the golden water pitcher would take place 7 times. This ritual recalled Exodus 17, God providing living water in the wilderness. Here, water was flowing from the sacrificial rock altar of the temple. In John 7, we read that Jesus was in Jerusalem for this festival. And I'm just going to read 2 verses from John 7, starting in verse 37. On the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." Wow. Right? The hyperlink between Exodus and the gospel is unmistakable here. I think it's good for us to pause and remember how God provided in the wilderness. God also used Jesus to provide in his time and continues to do so now. God is still providing. All right, that's part 1 of chapter 17. We'll be a little more brief in the second part. Verse 8, the Amalekites. Then the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. All right, let's just stop there. That's not a lot of information, is it? And Deuteronomy harkens back to this exact same situation. Deut is the word duet, right? Deuteronomy is literally the second telling of the same story. So Deuteronomy fleshes this out a little bit more for us. In chapter 25, it says this: remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on their journey and cut off all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. All right, who are the Amalekites? The Amalekites are descendants of Jacob's twin Esau. They're nomadic, and they're a thorn in the side of Israel. And they're picking off the weakest people from the outskirts of the camp. They're not confronting them head on. They're taking advantage of the weaker people. It's like a guerrilla warfare. So, verse 9, Moses said to Joshua, first appearance of Joshua, "Choose some of your men and go out and fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I'll stand on top of the hill with the staff of God again in my hands." Moses is saying, let's not deal with this the way that they're dealing with us, indirectly and in the back of things. Let's face this head on. So verse 10, so Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. Aaron is Moses' brother. We think Hur was Miriam's son, so Moses' nephew. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him and sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until sunset. And so Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with a sword. Verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it." That's so interesting. Make sure Joshua hears it. Make sure Joshua knows that he only won because the shepherd's staff was watching over him. Because I will completely blot out the name of the Amalek from under heaven. So Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. That's the end of 17. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. All right, this is not the Israelites arbitrarily looking to conquer a whole group of people. Remember, they're escaped slaves. They are not trained for battle. I actually am wondering where they got their weapons. I don't understand this passage at all. I think it's fascinating. God and God alone enables them to push off their attackers. It's God's banner, not the banner of an army. We read in the Song of Solomon that God's banner over us is love. A banner on a battlefield identifies your side. The Lord is my banner. I'm on the Lord's side, not on somebody else's side. I want us to notice 3 things here. Number 1, God saved the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt and wiped out Pharaoh's army. God was certainly not going to let another group of people wipe them out in the wilderness, where they were learning how to trust in God. This was another way for them to learn trust in God. 2, Moses raised the staff, the shepherd's staff. Have you ever tried to hold your hands up for a long period of time without putting them down? You'll probably be able to do it for less time than you think. But what is that posture when you raise your hands up? I don't know what else to do. Could be that. Could be praising. Could be surrender, right? A police officer would ask you to put your hands up so that you can't be defended. It's an interesting posture. Can also be a posture of worship. This posture leaves you vulnerable, does it not? And for Moses to be holding a shepherd's staff in his hand is showing that the shepherd, the good shepherd, is watching his sheep and taking care of them through this. And when he puts it down, they start losing. And when he raises it up, but he can't do it by himself. Well, that's point number 3. Moses needs help. Aaron and Hur stand next to him and hold his hands up. What a beautiful image, isn't it? Sometimes, even when we're surrendered to God, we still can't do it on our own. It's really hard to stay in this posture when you're being attacked. You kind of want to do this, don't you? You have to stay this way. Sometimes we need friends to help us keep our hands up in praise, in surrender, in non-defensiveness, in trust. Moses was able to do it with help. And in the next chapter of Exodus, we'll see even more of that. Moses raised the shepherd's staff, the same staff he had in his hand when God met him at the burning bush, the same staff that he had when he went to Pharaoh and God turned the water of the Nile River into blood, the same shepherd's staff that Moses raised when the waters of the Red Sea parted. Moses holds up the shepherd's staff on the hill. Can you hear the echoes of Psalm 23? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The staff was a tool that a shepherd could use to fend the predators off of the sheep. God is showing his people that he's a good shepherd and that he'll protect them. Fast forward about 1,500 years. Here comes Jesus. Again in the Gospel of John, what does he say? I am the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. I'm the one who lays down his life for the sheep. Some scholars have seen the raising of the staff on the hill as a raising of a piece of wood on top of a hill, much the way that the cross was raised on the hill. And Jesus' arms were raised in surrender to protect his sheep. So beautiful. So many hyperlinks between Exodus and the Gospels. God gives us living water. God is our shepherd. When we find ourselves in the wilderness, we can look back with gratitude. We can look forward with trust. Thanks be to God.